Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Strength and Hormones podcast. Today is another LOdown episode, and we are going to be talking about all the aspects to think about if you're trying to build lean muscle. And we're going to focus specifically on some of the macronutrients, so some of the types of food sources, and really just some of the mechanisms that go into building lean muscle mass. Now, I think that it's pretty universally well known that protein is one of the most important aspects for lean muscle building. But there's also another things to think about, and there's also minutia within just protein itself, thinking about what types of protein are you eating, how are you eating them, how much are you consuming, all of those variables. So let's get into today's episode. So first, specifically, how does protein even support muscle in general? Well, our muscle is primarily made up of about 80% of protein. So you need protein in order to just make muscle. Protein is also needed, though, for a lot of other functions. It's needed for your immune system. It's needed for hair growth. It's needed for liver detoxification, so many other purposes. So we want to make sure that we're definitely in a sufficiency of protein and that we're also getting in a wide diversity of amino acids. So amino acids are the building blocks of protein. So think of it as like the recipe is protein and the ingredients that you put into the recipe are the amino acids. And there's all different types of amino acids, and every protein source you eat contains different types of amino acids. So if you're plant-based or ever have been, you might know about amino acid pairing, where you pair different types of proteins together to create a complete protein source. But with animal proteins, they are all a complete protein source. So they have those essential amino acids in them, but they all vary a little bit in terms of how much of each of amino acids are present. So, for example, if you're eating a lot of muscle meats, then you're getting a lot of one particular amino acid versus if you're eating a lot of bone-in meats, you're getting other types of amino acids. And one of the reasons why I'm a big fan of eating bone-in proteins is because you get more of that glycine, which is one of the components of collagen, which is really important for our gut, for your skin, for healing of any component of the body. And so we want to make sure that we're not just eating the same types of protein sources, but that we're getting a diversity of those protein sources, regardless if it's animal proteins or plant proteins. Protein also creates an anabolic environment. So we don't always want to be in a state of anabolism. Anabolism sounds like a crazy word, but it basically just means growth. So we have two ways to think about it. You have anabolic, which means growth. You have catabolic, which means breaking down, so the opposite of growth. And now, if you're trying to build muscle, we want to be mostly in an anabolic state, but if we're trying to also think about longevity and overall health, we want to have some times where we're not necessarily in an anabolic state. We don't always want to be in a place where insulin growth factor, IGF-1, is high, because when IGF-1 is high, it does support our ability to build muscle, but it also creates growth of other things, growth of abnormal cells, which can lead to increased risk of chronic diseases like cancers and such. So there is some benefit to creating a catabolic state from time to time, but if you're trying to build lean muscle, we want to be really intentional with how we balance the two of those. So the timing of that anabolic state is going to be even more critical. Now, protein by itself isn't enough to build muscle. You do need other macronutrients and micronutrients as well for that to happen. But we're going to talk today about what you should know within the protein conversation if you are specifically trying to build lean muscle. Now, first you want to think about is the timing of the protein and when you're eating it. There is a lot of controversy about this, especially if you've been in any of like the workout type circles, bodybuilding gyms, whatever it might be. And you might have heard before that like you need to eat protein within 30 minutes or 1 hour of completing your workout. And the research just hasn't proven that to be true. What the research shows that is actually more critical is, are you maximizing a process called muscle protein synthesis? So what really matters is, in order for us to be able to build muscle, we need to be stimulating that process of muscle protein synthesis, or MPS, every 3 to 5 hours. So if you have done a workout and say you are working out starting at 12 and you haven't eaten since 10, then yeah, it's probably best for you to eat within an hour of finishing your workout, which would mean that you need to eat, maybe you finish your workout at 1, you need to eat by 2, because now your first meal was at 10 and now you haven't eaten since till 2, and that's 4 hours in between there, right? But if you ate directly before you started your workout, you have a little bit more wiggle room because it's not so much about you eating immediately after the workout as it is are you eating that enough protein every 3 to 5 hours to be able to maximize that muscle protein synthesis. Okay, so just kind of recap that. We're really focused on, are you getting enough protein every 3 to 5 hours? Not so much the timing of when that protein is coming in directly after you finish that workout. However, this could change based off of what your setup looks like. So for example, like for myself, I typically work out in the morning. So although I have a small snack before my workout, it's not enough protein in there to be able to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And so because of that, I make sure to eat really quickly after I finish my workout because I don't have enough already in circulation to be able to stimulate that muscle protein synthesis. But if I was working out in the afternoon and I'd had lunch an hour before I started my workout, I would be less worried about eating immediately after I got done. And maybe I could even wait until dinner time, just depending on what the time frame looks like of when I did that workout. So that's something to think about and to not stress yourself out about so much. Now, there are some criteria in order to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, which we're going to talk about in a bit. So hold on to that thought if you're wondering, okay, well, what does that look like? How much protein exactly are we talking about for that to happen? There is some benefit to consuming protein prior to your workout. During endurance exercise specifically, you burn about 5% of your energy from protein. But if you are in a low carbohydrate state, this actually goes closer to about 10%. So a lot of times people think of is that the only fuel you're burning during exercise is carbohydrate. And that is not true. You do burn mostly carbohydrate, especially at moderate and high intensities, but you do also burn a little bit of fat and a little bit of protein, especially as you get into some of the longer duration exercise. So really with like that endurance exercise. You also break down more protein. You're in more of a catabolic state when progesterone levels are high. So such as in the luteal phase, that 2-week time period before your period, or if you're on progesterone replacement therapy, then you're actually in more of a catabolic state. And so we need to be more mindful about protein intake in that type of situation as well. But there is some benefit to doing protein prior to exercise or during because it can help to be able to provide that fuel source that your body's burning and help to prevent your body breaking down its stores to use that as an energy source. And that's one of the reasons why I recommend that in your pre-workout, you're not just eating something that's purely carbohydrate, but there is also some protein in there to help to be able to mitigate that muscle protein breakdown. So we know that consuming protein following exercise stimulates post-exercise muscle protein synthesis. So remember that ability to gain muscle. It also stimulates our net muscle protein, basically build up effect. So our ability to create more of that muscle, and also facilitates our ability for skeletal muscle to adapt to the exercise or the workout that you just did. Whenever you are in a prolonged situation of exercise. So there's several benefits to how protein is working specifically after exercise to be able to help with that recovery process. Now, when that protein is paired with carbohydrate, you also get the added benefit of enhanced glycogen. And glycogen is that storage form of carbohydrate. And so generally speaking, we have an adequate amount of glycogen for several days worth of utilizing that as an energy source, or at least several hours. This will depend on how many carbohydrates you're consuming in your diet though. But we really want to make sure we have enough glycogen on board for any like more longer term type workouts or exercise type endeavors. So think more so like endurance exercise, or I'm currently even thinking about this as it relates to labor because you use a lot of glycogen in labor because it's basically like a marathon, right? Where your body is in a high energy state for an extended period of time. And so in a situation like that, we want to make sure our glycogen reserves are totally tapped out. And one of the ways that we can ensure of that is by incorporating carbohydrate with protein after you get done with exercise. The other benefit to that, which I've talked about before on that podcast, is you have enhanced insulin sensitivity after workouts. So that just means that after you get done exercising, your muscle is like a sponge to that carbohydrate. So instead of you eating that carbohydrate and it staying in the bloodstream, your muscle is actually preferentially pulling that carbohydrate out of the bloodstream back into the muscle. And that's where we want that carbohydrate to go. We don't want it hanging out in the bloodstream, causing elevated blood sugar. We don't want it going primarily to the liver, because that's how you can get something like fatty liver. We want it to go into the muscle. That's where we're going to have the best insulin sensitivity, and you have an enhanced ability for that to happen. So if you're going to eat carbohydrate, really the best timing would be to do it with that post-workout, because of the purpose for enhancing glycogen and also enhancing and kind of working with your body's own natural insulin sensitivity. So I mentioned about eating protein prior to your workout and the potential benefits of that. And like I mentioned, if you have protein prior, that it can inhibit muscle protein breakdown. So essentially you're decreasing your body's ability to break down its own muscles to get the protein from there. And you're getting protein from what you're eating to be able to help mitigate that. So it doesn't need to be a substantial amount. If you're trying to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, then we want to hit that threshold. But in order for you to just mitigate the muscle protein breakdown, you could just be looking at a couple of grams, like 10 grams of protein beforehand. There is some research as well that's come out recently about that protein being a rich source of collagen, and that helping to actually enhance collagen resynthesis after exercise, primarily when the body's in a high estrogen state. So we've known for several years that if you're trying to heal any type of soft tissues like ligaments or joints, that consuming collagen prior to exercise can actually help to be able to heal your soft tissues faster. But now there's new research coming out that if you're in a high estrogen state, a similar thing can happen. So we're not necessarily helping the body heal your ligaments and joints faster necessarily, but we're helping with more of that collagen absorption into the body. And remember that collagen is the number one protein in the body. It's very important for your skin, your hair, your uterus, all of these different functions, your gut as well. So that's a benefit if we can enhance collagen absorption. So a high estrogen state would be either you are on an oral contraceptive, you are pregnant, or you are around ovulation. So your estrogen levels slowly climb throughout the follicular phase. They're going to peak right around ovulation, which is generally going to be somewhere between like day 14 to day 20 of your cycle, with day 1 being the first day of bleeding, so about halfway through your cycle. And then they're going to slowly taper back down into the luteal phase right before you start your period. So generally that halfway point, that's when that estrogen is at its peak. And that might be a time where you can incorporate the collagen as your protein source before exercise. So now we're mitigating that muscle protein breakdown, and we're getting all of the benefits to collagen resynthesis after you get done with that workout. So I'm all about efficiency. And, when that research came out, I was like, why not? You're killing two birds with one stone, and collagen's such an easy thing to incorporate. Like you can have it in a tea or coffee or something before you do your workout alongside of a carbohydrate rich option. So I think it's a really good, easy option to incorporate. So let's talk about dosages and in terms of how much we're looking at. So when we think about protein, start by thinking about the totality of the day, but really focus more so on when you're eating it, how much you're eating, because our body doesn't enhance, it doesn't absorb protein, and it doesn't activate muscle protein synthesis at 10 p.m. every day based off of how much protein you ate that day. Muscle protein synthesis is happening every 3 to 5 hours. Remember, muscle protein synthesis is our body's ability to build muscle. So we really want to be thinking about how much are you consuming throughout the day at those different intervals to be able to maximize that process. So in the totality of the day, we're looking at probably somewhere around 1.7 grams per kilogram body weight. Now, some people just say that it's easy to just think of 1 gram per pound body weight. But really, the research doesn't look at things in pounds. It does it all in kilos. And I know for Americans that's hard to think about. But if you don't know how to convert your body weight from pounds to kilos, then you just take your body weight, divide it by 2.2, and then multiply that times 1.7 to get that number. Now, it is more accurate to work off of your fat-free mass number. So fat-free mass, if you have it, is essentially everything except for fat. So if you go and get like a bod pod or a DEXA scan or something like that done, you should have that data. And basically what we're looking at is, what is this structure? How much weight is of the bone structure, and how much muscle mass do you have? What's that combined total? Because those are the components in the body that need protein. You don't need protein in order to fund fat mass, right? So that could be a more accurate way to look at this, but most people don't have that data. And so if you don't worry about it. I would just go based off 1.7 grams per your total body weight, and that's in kilograms, okay? And that's a general recommendation. I would say for most people across the board, it's going to work really well. If you're endurance exerciser, if you're strength training, if you're an aging person, that's going to be a really good target to shoot for. There may be situations where you want to go a little bit higher than that, but generally I wouldn't recommend going any lower than 1.7 grams per kilogram. There is some research that shows in aging individuals, maybe even closer to like 2 grams per kilogram might be a better target. So we're talking about like elderly people that are trying to prevent fragility and sarcopenia and such. I doubt any of you on this podcast that are listening to this podcast are in that camp, but maybe you have someone in your life that is. And I think a lot of older individuals are really scared of consuming protein, but it is one of the best ways to prevent fragility and age-related muscle loss, which is essentially just the natural decline in muscle that's helping to protect your bone and metabolism as you get older. Now, keep in mind that really when it comes to protein and muscle, it's all about the amino acid leucine. So I mentioned earlier that those amino acids are like the ingredients of the recipe. And there's some amino acids that are more important than others. And the one that we really care about the most is this one called leucine. And it's really how much leucine are you getting every 3 to 5 hours to maximize that muscle protein synthesis. If you are eating animal proteins, most animal proteins are going to come very close to the amount of leucine that you're looking for, but the research shows that you need about 3 grams of leucine every 3 to 5 hours. So that's equivalent to about 160 grams of steak. That could be 160 grams is I think about like 5 ounces or so that you're looking for. But you can go online and you can search what is the leucine content of, common foods, and you can see how much of that you would have to consume in order to hit that leucine threshold. You do need about 5 eggs. So it's better to actually think about not so much the protein, but how much leucine is in there when we're thinking about maximizing that muscle protein synthesis. You can also potentially add in like a leucine supplement on top of your protein that you're consuming if you don't think that you're getting enough of it. But it's one of the reasons why a lot of people turn to a lot of protein powders is because they generally have a higher leucine content than would be real food. And so you're able to hit that threshold with a little bit lower protein content. For example, our Functional Fuel Pro has about 2.4 grams of leucine per serving. And so you're getting pretty close to that 3 gram threshold by just doing 1 serving of that protein powder. If you do 1.5 servings, you're even closer to that. Now, if you are a vegetarian and you are not eating animal proteins, you're probably going to have to consume a little bit more protein than you might think you need to in order to hit that leucine threshold, because plants just don't have as much leucine in them as does animal proteins. So, for example, about 120 gram serving of navy beans has 1 gram of leucine. And 120 grams is equivalent to about like 5 ounces again. So it's a pretty big serving of beans. You would have to eat 3 times that. That's like 15 ounces of beans to be able to get enough leucine. It's quite a bit. And so it might make more sense to pair multiple protein sources together to be able to make that happen, or to use something like a supplemental leucine option to be able to help you get there. But leucine by far has the most potent effect on that ability to build muscle through muscle protein synthesis, and it needs to be ingested at a dose of about 2 to 3 grams. But I think that some of the research is more clear that it needs to be closer to 3 grams, and that needs to happen every 3 to 5 hours when your body is in that state to go through that muscle protein synthesis. So essentially, if you kind of think of it as like a upside, like a roller coaster, right, is that every 3 to 5 hours, your body is able to stimulate muscle protein synthesis if we consume adequate leucine and protein, and then it comes back down, then it goes back up, and that whole process is happening all throughout the day. So we want to make sure we're not missing any of those timings, okay? Now, within that, if you want to just, you're like, okay, thinking about leucine is just too much for me to think about, then just think about how much protein that you're consuming every 3 to 5 hours. And the number you really want to aim for there is about 0.3 grams per kilogram every 3 to 5 hours. So again, if you take your body weight, divide it by 2.2, and then multiply that times 0.3, that'll give you about what you're looking for at that every 3 to 5 hour threshold. It still might be a little bit low on the leucine side of things, depending on what protein source you're consuming, but that is a good rule of thumb that's going to be based off of your body weight. And again, if you have that fat-free mass number, that's an even more accurate way to be able to identify that. If you are in a hypocaloric state, which means that you are in a deficit of calories, maybe you've been actively trying to lose weight, you know you're not eating, what you should be or how much your body is demanding of you on a day-to-day basis, then you might need an even higher protein content to be able to build and preserve your lean muscle mass. One of the ways to be able to try to build muscle when you are in a hypocaloric state is to ingest a little bit more protein. And some of the research shows that you might even need upwards of about 2.4 grams of protein per kilogram body weight if you are in a hypocaloric state to be able to help with that ability to build lean muscle mass. So that threshold from 1.7 actually increases when our body's in a hypocaloric state. Of course, we don't want to be in a hypocaloric state forever. That's not good for you. It's not great for your hormones. But if that is something that you're currently pursuing, then it's something to keep in mind that that protein need actually increases. And then you want to take that total daily amount and again, divide that by your every 3 to 5 hours. So generally that accounts to eating protein probably 4 times per day if you think about it in the scope of a 24-hour time period. And then, depending on like the timing of your workouts and things, that might kind of fluctuate based off of that. But definitely 3 times per day ingesting, the 0.3 grams per kilogram is just not going to cut it. It's not going to be sufficient. So I would say at least 4, maybe even 5 times per day to be able to get to that threshold. So when we're thinking about the ability to build lean muscle mass, protein is going to be a really critical aspect. Our body just being in a eucaloric state is going to be another really important aspect. So again, like I said, you can build lean muscle if you are in a caloric deficit, but you're only going to be able to do it for so long until those stress hormone levels increase, your thyroid hormone levels start to decrease, and things start to work against you. And then at that point, you are going to need to be more in a eucaloric state, which means that we're essentially eating as much energy as our body needs on a day-to-day basis to fund all of our organ systems, our reproduction, so on and so forth. Now, it's also important that we're thinking about, just within all of the other components of your diet, how much fat and carbohydrates are you consuming? That's not something we're really going to focus on today because they're not as important as protein is for lean muscle building. But depending on your goals and maybe your labs, and if you have insulin resistance or if you have hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's, then that would dictate really how much of those other macronutrients are taking up the place of the total amount of those calories that you're consuming in one day. But protein and the total amount is going to be the first place that I really recommend starting. You could also look at utilizing a supplement like creatine monohydrate. Creatine monohydrate can be another great way to support muscle protein synthesis and lean muscle growth. There's a lot of bad fears around creatine, but creatine is probably one of the most researched supplements on the market. And it's been researched for a really long time, since like the early 1900s. And there's a lot of research on its role, not just for, exercise and muscle, but also for the brain and for aging populations as well. And so there's a lot of benefits that you're getting, especially if you are vegetarian, because if you are not eating animal proteins, you're not getting as much creatine because creatine is mainly found in those animal proteins that you're consuming. So it could be a really great way to be able to provide a little bit more support outside of thinking about maybe things like the leucine conversation that we also talked about. Now, outside of just what you're eating, we also have to think about, are you stimulating the muscle? So you can eat as much protein as you want, and you might be able to sustain the muscle you have. But if you're not stimulating the muscle through resistance training, you're not going to really be able to get very far in terms of building new lean muscle mass. And especially if your body is more prone to a catabolic state because you're in a high progesterone state, or because you had just had surgery, or whatever it might be that your body's healing from, then you might need to be stimulating that muscle a little bit more often. So it's one of the reasons why with our strength and hormones workouts, we have 3 full body resistance training days per week, because when you do those full body resistance training days, you're getting the greatest growth hormone response from that. You're able to really maximize that ability to build lean muscle mass. But because those workouts are more consolidated, it also gives you enough time to be able to recover your nervous system so that we're not perpetuating the state of chronic high cortisol, which is not what we're looking for, because then that starts to deteriorate other hormonal aspects in the body. So with those 3 days per week, we generally recommend is try to keep at least 1 or 2 days in between them so that you can bring down that cortisol response. You can reactivate your nervous system into more of a parasympathetic state. But then during those workouts, you're getting all of the muscle protein synthesis benefits. And we want to make sure that all 7 days of the week that we're eating in a way that's enhancing muscle protein synthesis to really be able to support lean muscle growth. every year after really age 30, you're losing lean muscle mass. So this conversation is not just for you if you're trying to build lean muscle for like aesthetic reasons. I know for me, that's not why I resistance train or eat protein. It's because if you are trying to just age well and you are trying to stay metabolically healthy, you're trying to prevent blood sugar related issues, you're trying to keep your bones nice and strong as you get older, you want to be thinking about these things really after the age of 30, because those deposits are happening now to protect you for the future. Once you go through menopause, for women and your estrogen levels drop, or for men, once your testosterone levels start to drop, you really can't make any more deposits into your bone. And so when we can stimulate our muscle and we can provide some of that bone mineral support now, we actually can prevent more bone related issues happening when you are in those later years once those hormone levels drop. So it's all part of the bigger conversation of how do we support our body now, but also into the future to be able to support our hormones now and then support prevention of more chronic type diseases and fragility, sarcopenia, those types of things down the road. So I hope this answered you guys' questions about lean muscle building. I know I've gotten a few questions from you guys about it and the different things to think about as it relates to what you're eating and how you're eating throughout the day. If you guys have any questions on it, come let me know over on Instagram, and we'll see you guys back for another episode here soon.